Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello from Perth, Australia, the first of two Start the Week shows from Down Under and a different perspective on some of the issues we've been talking about pretty regularly at home, from Britain's place in the world to the rise of China and climate change. I'm joined by Jeff Hutchinson, who hosts the morning radio show on ABC Perth, the most isolated major city on earth, by the way, capital of the huge state of West Australia, which is enjoying a boom mainly fuelled by mining. And its Minister for Mines, Norman Moore, joins me, as does the former Government Economic Advisor, Andrew Charlton, who writes about climate change, a huge issue in Australia as at home. First, though, at the end of the Perth Commonwealth Summit, these meetings go by the chewy and rather drear acronym CHOGM. We're going to talk about whether this huge organisation, which claims to represent a third of the planet's humanity, 54 countries, big and small, rich and poor, whether it really works, whether it really makes any sense. Danny Sriskandaraja runs the Commonwealth Foundation, part of the Commonwealth setup. Danny, you're inside the organisation, but you're allowed to be critical of it too. Let's start off talking about this particular summit. It was said to be going to be a failure if it didn't produce an independent commissioner on human rights and didn't agree at Charter on human rights. Hasn't done those things. Has it been a failure?
Well, it's been a bit of both. It's been a success in the sense that, at least for the first time in a long time, the Commonwealth is talking about itself and how it can get teeth and become relevant. But I think many of us, especially after the week we've had, feel a bit depressed that, this iconic new measure, an independent commissioner on human rights, has been kicked into the long grass because it's going to be put to a committee of ministers who will consider it seriously over the next who knows how many years.
I mean, as I said at the beginning, it is an organisation with so many different kinds of states, tiny, tiny little dots in the ocean, through to some of the world's most important economies, huge, huge countries like Australia, like India. And it's said that what binds the Commonwealth together are its values. Yeah. And yet I wonder which values actually bind it together.
Well, I think that was the question that dominated the agenda over the last few days. And, history alone is not going to keep the Commonwealth alive. In fact, history is the thing that binds Commonwealth countries, but history alone is not going to be a sufficient reason for it to exist in the next few decades. And values is probably the closest thing we have. It's a voluntary association that, when it's been at its best, has talked to a moral conscience. The struggle against apartheid in Africa, in southern Africa, was the Commonwealth at its best, playing that vanguard role. And I think many of us, inside and outside, look to the Commonwealth as a values-based association. But what we've seen this week is that it's very difficult to get the Malawis and the Ugandas of the world to agree a set of common values with the Australias and the Britons of the world.
And at the same time, there is just an enormous amount of sort of politically correct hot air swilling around it. I mean, I sat through the last press conference of the Commonwealth, and I have never been at a duller press conference, I have to say.
You should have had the pleasure of sitting through hours and hours of meetings that preceded the press conference.
Jeff Hutchinson, what do your listeners make of an event like CHOGM? It's caused a huge amount of disruption, of course, in Perth, but it has put Perth on the front of a lot of front pages.
Not disruption, excitement. I think there are two stories this week. One is the visit by Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh to a town where she has always been very warmly welcomed. There's been, Perth has looked very nice, much excitement that we win CHOGM. So there's been a lot of goodwill and a lot of good feeling about what's been achieved here. And then there's the CHOGM part of it all, which I wouldn't say it bores people rigid, but I think people have started the week hearing exactly as Danny said, these phrases and affirmations of shared values. And then every now and again you get a whisper from someone who says, it's the Queen and cricket, really, that is the shared value. And
yes.
that is a historical tie and a traditional tie. And look, let me just very briefly read you a little bit of this afternoon's communique for those who weren't here to get the highlights. Heads reaffirmed their commitment to the values and principles of the Commonwealth and agreed to a series of actions to maintain the Commonwealth's relevance, to ensure its effectiveness in responding to contemporary global challenges and to build resilient societies and economies.
It does sound, doesn't it, Danny, a little bit like we've resolved to talk about talking.
Well, part of the problem is the Commonwealth has so few resources at its disposal, so it can't, throw millions or billions at a global problem in the way that the World Bank or other international institutions can. So, we keep coming back to, it's hot air or nothing else.
Norman Moore, you are, I think, one of the longest-serving politicians in the state. We were told in Britain that there was a really strong rising Republican movement in this country, and yet the Queen's visit here has been fantastically popular, fantastically successful. And you're looking at the polling now, and the Republican cause seems to be falling back, partly because of things like the Queen's visit.
Well, I think it's not correct to say that there's a rising tide of republicanism in Australia. I think it's always been about a 50-50 at the best. But the Queen has been the reason why the Republican movement hasn't really made the progress that I think its leaders would have liked to see happen. And she is very well regarded, indeed loved in Australia, and particularly in places like Western Australia. We're a bit isolated from the rest of the country, and we have a quite special relationship probably with the United Kingdom. There are lots of migrants from the UK who live in Western Australia.
You hear a lot of British voices on the street here, I have to say.
And on Jeff's program, bringing to say that they met the Queen and it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened to them. And this week in Western Australia has been quite extraordinary. 100,000 people turned up for a barbecue to say farewell, and that's quite a fantastic achievement.
And yet, as a minister for the most important industry around about here, presumably the meetings that matter most to you are meetings with other Asian countries rather than something like CHOGM.
Well, the West Australian resources growth in recent times has been very much on the basis of our relationship with China. And indeed, the West Australian government has initiated a relationship with the Chinese government that's a bit different from other parts of Australia. We have entered into MOUs with various Chinese government organisations because we see the future of Western Australia, certainly in the short term, as being very much dependent upon ongoing continued growth in China. And while they continue to grow at 9%, we've got a market. If and when that was to decrease, then that's going to cause us some problems. So
is it fair to say, I mean, this does seem to be one of the most Anglo-Saxon or British parts of Australia, traditionally at any rate, and yet Australia is now on quite a fast trajectory away from Europeanness and towards becoming a fully Asian country.
When I was growing up, this was a bit of a white bread town. I think things have changed in the last 20, 25 years. There are a lot of international students here, and really Western Australia has positioned itself very smartly, I think, to be the Indian Ocean hub, where its eyes are turned to what Asia represents. And geographically, we are closer to Jakarta than we are to Canberra, and the opportunities that come with that are enormous. And it also helps our sort of slightly anxious, isolated feeling that we sometimes don't feel loved enough by the rest of the country, so we turn our back and say we'll look elsewhere.
Andrew Charlton, I wonder, we'll talk properly about climate change in a while, but just in terms of what the Commonwealth's values are, one of the writers here was making the point that even on something like climate change, there are pro-carbon tax, anti-carbon tax, countries that are really worried about climate change, countries that couldn't care less about climate change because they're just interested in growth because they're so poor, that even there isn't really a kind of common value.
Look, I think that's right, but I think that's one of the things that makes the Commonwealth such a valuable institution. There are so many challenges we face as a world now that reach across regional groupings and reach across traditional alliances, and the Commonwealth is a quite remarkable grouping of countries from right across the world, big and small, from almost every continent, and it's quite a unique opportunity, I think, to discuss issues of global significance among a very diverse group. And I think we saw that at the last Commonwealth meeting, where it was in the lead up to the Copenhagen Climate Conference, and there was an extremely important discussion of climate change that produced a declaration across a wide range of countries. So I think the Commonwealth has value as much for its diversity as for what binds it together.
There was an interesting moment in the press conference at CHOGM earlier today when President Nasheed from the Maldives interrupted the press conference to sort of almost personally thank the Australian Prime Minister for her recently introduced carbon tax on behalf of the good people of the Maldives. And it was, it brought home that, there's a potential for dialogue and solidarity, I suppose, in a world that's so...
It sure matters to him, doesn't it?
Yeah, it certainly does.
He was a very impressive guy. He'd spent half of his life in prison, he pointed out at one point, when we were talking about the rights issues. We mentioned the Queen just now, Danny. Do you think that the Commonwealth will survive the Queen? That clearly her fascinated interest in it all through her reign has had a big impact on keeping it going. But do you think post this Queen it can last?
I think when Her Majesty passes away, we will struggle to keep the interest in the Commonwealth. I mean, I got the sense this week in Chogham that it was almost as exciting for some world leaders to turn up to a meeting where Her Majesty was present as it was to meet their colleagues who they see fairly regularly at international summit after international summit. And it's not just in her person, but it is that, she said something very interesting in the opening address, which is about, challenging leaders there present to react boldly to some of the reform proposals and to make the Commonwealth fresh and fit for purpose. This is from an 80-year-old woman telling them that they need to make this a fresh and fit for purpose organisation.
A challenge which some people would say they notably failed to pick up.
I think it was like a reminder to them that said, after I am gone, the responsibility will be yours to continue with this, which was quite a message.
Yeah. And of course, it wasn't actually inevitable. We now think it's inevitable. It wasn't inevitable that she would become head of the Commonwealth at all, was it, Danny?
No, absolutely. There's this sort of strange moment that happened when her father passed away, and he, as you may know, was made the symbolic head of this new voluntary association of nations. But when he passed away, there was no one had taken the decision about what would happen when he did pass away. But Nehru, being the Anglophile that he was, apparently telegrammed Buckingham Palace to congratulate Princess Elizabeth on her about to become the head of the Commonwealth, and the deal was done.
There's going to be quite a row, I would have thought, at the next Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, which is going to be in Sri Lanka, where there's been really serious human rights abuses and arguments and questions going on, and the Canadians have already said they're not going to go unless the thing changes.
Yeah, I think, the credibility of the Commonwealth at a moment when it was supposed to be talking about human rights and these shared values is going to suffer a body blow over the next few days as people realise that, here's this association that hasn't, I don't have a problem with the next Chogham being in Sri Lanka, but there has to be some acknowledgement by the Commonwealth in a public domain about, some of the challenges that country faces, or even more positively for the Commonwealth to play an active role in peace building and reconciliation in the Commonwealth. My problem is that the Commonwealth hasn't done either. It hasn't, has offered neither the stick nor the carrot in terms of Sri Lanka, and to me that's a problem.
Well, let's move from the Commonwealth itself to the host of the Commonwealth and Perth and West Australia. Jeff, we've said it's got very, very sort of Anglo-Saxon traditions and history, a lot of British people here and so on. Just paint us a little bit of a picture about the state as well as Perth. First of all, it's absolutely vast.
The UK could fit into Western Australia more than 10 times. There's 2.3 million people living here. It's got the fastest growth rate of the country, which is still only 2.2%. I think the estimate is that population will double in 30 to 40 years. In terms of taking the full advantage of these very good economic opportunities, I think Deloitte's described it as spellbinding the other day. It's expected that we'll need 36,000 tradesmen within the next 4 years. The skill shortage will be a huge issue in Western Australia.
And it's eye-wateringly expensive here, I have to say.
It is eye-wateringly expensive, it is.
About almost 10 quid for a pint of beer I was being charged.
Yeah, you're being ripped off, Andrew. I think we knew you were here.
Yeah. And then, of course, all around Perth, there's these vast mining sites. And yet mining is a kind of, it's an ambiguous thing to rely on, isn't it? Because certainly in the mining towns, people don't very often bring their families. You get the particular sort of macho culture, people fly in and then fly back out again.
Well, that is a very significant part of our mining industry, is fly in, fly out. It's not just out of Perth. It's out of Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane and indeed New Zealand, sometimes Bali, workers flying in from all over the place. And that is necessary because we simply don't have the infrastructure in the mining towns to cater for significant increases in population. But at the same time, a lot of mining operations are very short-lived. So there's no point in building a town for a 5-year mining operation. So it's fly in, fly out. So we have a very significant number of workers who are doing that. But Jeff makes a good point. We will have a shortage of skilled labour in this country, in this state, and that's going to grow. So I guess those folk in the United Kingdom who may be looking for alternative employment, here's the place to come.
They're peering out of the window and it's a dark, dark sky and winter's coming in and here it's beautiful sunshine and
28 degrees today.
The beer may be expensive, but it's very good. And
well, I think you must have gone to the wrong place because I don't drink there. I couldn't afford that.
And the key exports here, iron ore tends to be the biggest of all, going almost overwhelmingly to China. Is that right?
iron ore is about 58% of our total exports at the present time, but it is growing massively. And to give some indication of how it's grown, in the 1960s when BHP and Rio began their mining operations in the Pilbara, they were looking at 5 million tonnes a year each. We're now looking at 300 million tonnes a year each. It is just massive growth. And then you've also got Atlas Iron, FMG and other companies now coming into the business, all based upon this dramatic demand coming out of China, all designed so that those citizens of China who have very low standards of living can in fact enjoy a far better lifestyle. And I think that growth will continue while the Chinese government sees that as a political imperative.
So apart from luring large numbers of Brits over to work in the mines, what is the economic buffer? What stops just perpetual growth? Are the competitor economies providing similar mineral resources?
Well, there are a number of issues facing us. One is skill shortages. Two is the cost of doing business in Western Australia. But probably more importantly in the longer term, perhaps in the next 10 to 15, 20 years, will be competition from particularly Africa. And there are very large numbers of Australian mining companies that are very active in Africa because they're a bit like Western Australia was 40 years ago, with largely undeveloped resources of very high grade, very poor infrastructure, and that's going to change because the Chinese are paying a premium at the present time, say, for iron ore, and they are looking for alternative sources of supply, and that applies, of course, with Brazil as well. So we need to be very careful about how we go about taxing this industry here in this country, because the competition is going to come hard and loud.
Andrew Charlton, you were a government economic advisor for a long time. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think Australia is going through an extraordinary mining boom. We have the scale of the mineral wealth in Australia is astounding. We have nearly 20% of the world's proven reserves of minerals, with just 2% of the world's population. So that is an extraordinary opportunity right now to benefit from that. And it's true that in a few years we'll have significant competition. I mean, I noted that one of the largest delegations here at CHOGM was from that well-known Commonwealth country, China, who was attending the business forums and other side events, primarily for the purpose, I think, of networking with Australian and African and other Commonwealth countries who they are seeking to develop as alternative suppliers of resources.
We're also seeing China starting even to buy up some farmland in Australia so to grow food, just as they've been buying up farmland in Africa as well. Is there a kind of unease in Australia, in West Australia, other parts of Australia, about becoming effectively a Chinese economic colony?
I think there's unease because people don't know the extent to which it will impact on their lives, the notion of the Chinese buying farms to feed a population, the level of Chinese investment. Does that mean we require Chinese expertise to come in and build some of the projects that the Chinese are looking at? But it depends. I mean, some people see it as opportunities, some people become anxious about it, but I don't get a sense that we know enough about it to really have an informed opinion on its impact.
Well, most of the development in Australia has been brought about by foreign investment, and we're quite comfortable to take money from the United Kingdom, from the United States, from Japan. Why are we not comfortable taking it from China? I think the concern, however, that there's probably an underlying concern in Australia, and that is Chinese companies that are government-owned buying strategic assets and being involved in strategic infrastructure. And I think there is a concern about the extent that may give those companies and therefore the Chinese government a role in
leverage.
And involved in the production and in the purchase of the same product, and therefore affecting the market price.
And Norman Moore, as Minister for Mining, would you also acknowledge, though, that it's not universally beneficial, the mining boom? There are lots of people who just find life very, very expensive as a result.
I think that's fair to say. Those working directly in the mining industry are doing very well. They are paid very well, but they work very, very long hours. And as I was saying earlier, many of them fly in and fly out, which is a pretty difficult lifestyle at the same time. Since
we've got you here and you're an expert on these things, I must just ask you about shale gas deposits, because we've, in Britain, there's a large shale gas field been found quite underneath Blackpool, but alongside Blackpool. And a great cries of delight, and then Blackpool suffered a couple of minor tremors or earthquakes. and because they don't want Blackpool to fall into a hole, things are stopped at the moment. Can you just explain about this industry and fracking, I think it's called, what that is?
Well, can I say there are vast areas of the world where shale gas or tight gas is located. You may be aware that the United States was in fact looking at importing LNG from Western Australia about 10 years ago because they had a shortage of gas. Now they've got a surplus of gas because of shale gas. And Western Australia has, I think, 288 trillion cubic feet of shale gas, which is twice the amount of gas coming out of the Northwest Shelf, which is a conventional gas supply. So there is a lot of it around the world.
Which sounds like good news, but it's controversial. Why?
Well, it's like the gas is located in a geological structure which requires the rock to be broken up because the gas won't flow naturally as it does in a conventional gas or oil and gas well. It requires the companies to drill vertical holes, then have a horizontal drilling activity attached to that, and then to force water and sometimes chemicals and ceramic material down into the tight shale formations, which then breaks up the shale. It then allows the gas to flow. And there are concerns that it may contaminate underground water supplies. In Queensland and Australia, there is a lot of coal seam gas, which is a bit similar, but the coal seams are much closer to the water aquifers than generally you find with tight gas or shale gas. I think any country that's got a large resource of shale gas should be very happy with that because it's onshore, it's probably a bit more expensive to get out, but the drilling costs initially are much less. And gas is about half the greenhouse gases of coal.
Andrew Charlton, you've written an essay called Man-Made World, Choosing Between Progress and Planet, which is fundamentally about climate change. But in that, you make the argument that actually that some of the new technologies and the technical fixes and so on that we need to ensure that we've still got an energy supply in the future, we really have to invest money in. Is fracking and shale gas one of those, or is it a bad thing in your view?
Well, it's a difficult problem because the world, is looking for new sources of energy, and shale gas is clearly a very positive one, as is a range of other hydrocarbons which are available but difficult to extract as the world's reserves of oil are depleted. But on the other hand, we have a terrible problem associated with climate change. So we have to not only find new sources of energy to secure our energy supplies, but also very rapidly shift to alternative sources of energy.
Danny, if the Commonwealth started to get seriously engaged in climate change and started to look at some of the energy security issues, is that something that the organisation is actually tooled up to do, or is everything going to be about rights and so on? I mean, how much of the kind of nitty-gritty discussions about the technology and the technology transfer and so on actually take place here?
Climate change, I think, is the perfect issue. It's the perfect 21st century challenge for an organisation like the Commonwealth. It's never going to be a treaty-making body, so that's fine, but it could well play a very important role in sharing knowledge, in some of that technology transfer, being an incubator, a hothouse for different ways of tackling global challenges around climate change. And I think, it's using this network creatively. Yes, sometimes it's got to be about rights and values, but it can just be a very practical, collaborative. The Commonwealth is a perfect platform for collaboration because of shared language, of shared institutional structures. If you wanted to experiment at a global scale, it's the perfect platform.
But it does require popular enthusiasm. And Jeff Hutchinson, as the man with your finger on the pulse of Perth, are people concerned about climate change at the moment? Is this, you look around you and it seems such a balmy and pleasant environment in many ways.
I think people might be concerned about climate change, but in Australia, you can't deconstruct that from the political situation surrounding it.
Which is the carbon tax proposal.
Which is the carbon tax, and really an unhappiness in this country about federal politics particularly. So people are not very well engaged. Try and explain it to them. And I know, Andrew, you've written about this. I think people seem to think if only we could explain climate change better to people, then people will understand it better. From your experience, that's not how you see it, is it?
No, I mean, I think, in Australia we've had a very long debate about climate change, and if anything, it's leading to a divergence of opinion. I think some recent polling shows that those who that over the last 10 years, the people who were sort of in the middle have have spread out and are now either fiercely opposed or strongly in favour of a carbon
And
tax.
I should explain the carbon tax would be the heaviest and most serious carbon tax anywhere in the world if it went through. And Julia Gillard, the Prime Minister, said before she became Prime Minister that she would never lead a government which introduced a carbon tax, and now she is. What's all that about?
Well, and part of that, though, is the political complication in this country at the moment. We have effectively a minority government. I don't know how it's going at your place, Andrew, but here, this is a country that has really not experienced anything like that. So you have an opposition which genuinely believes that if it's not in power now, it should be in power. And the nature of political debate is extremely negative. And there, it seems to be a complete inability to actually deal with issues as they should be dealt with.
And yet, you would think if ever there was a country which was well placed to talk about climate change, Australia is not going through the kind of recession that's hitting Europe and America. It's doing pretty well, and that, we're told at home that people aren't interested in climate change because they're so worried about the economy. Well, they're not worried about the economy here, and they've got a Green holding the balance of power in the government.
I think we're suffering from a very mild depressive illness in this country. I think there's an acknowledgement that there isn't much acknowledgement that we're living in a place where actually things are not too bad at all, but don't tell the people that.
Yeah, I can't work this out. Norman, you'd agree that? You were nodding at the depressive nature of the country at the moment.
Jeff's absolutely right. It's a very strange environment we live in, a strange political environment brought about by a change of the Prime Minister and the associated election and the promises that were made and then the cobbled together government after the election. And a number of policy reversals that have taken place, and the influence of the Greens, I think, adding all that together has created a very unpleasant and unhappy political environment in this country. But it's not fair to say that everybody in Australia is doing well. I mean, there are significant problems in some of our eastern states, Victoria and New South Wales, where their economies are not going that well at all.
To what extent do Australians feel that their state identity almost trumps their Australianness? I know there's a lot of anger in this part of Australia, in West Australia, about the amount of money that goes to the federal government and how little you get back, and a lot of people have said to me that they really can't stand the federal government.
It depends which state you're in. If you're in Queensland and Western Australia, there has been that long history of suspicion that the either the Southerners or the Eastern Staters are taking too big a share of what we produce. Norman,
but it's not only that, Jeff. Perth is a very long way from Canberra, and it's a long way physically, but it's also a long way from the point of view of what people think about what should happen in this country. And a federal government that invents a thing like a super profits tax for the mining industry to finance some uncompetitive industries in the eastern states by penalising successful industries in Western Australia demonstrates a lack of understanding of how people think here. And indeed, secession was something that was talked about and indeed was agreed to by a referendum of West Australians in 1934.
Norman's been keen on this for some time.
I've been keen on it all my life because we have a different economy, we have a different attitude, we relate to different parts of the world now.
And there's been absolutely no support for it, Norman, all due respect.
Yeah. Oh, Jeff, I don't know who you talk to, but without getting into argument about that, let me say that there is a view in Western Australia that, look, please understand we have some issues here that we need the Commonwealth government to address.
Are you all a bit Texan out here? I mean, there is some sort of parallel. The big sort of energy producing, slightly rugged, slightly frontier spirit part of the country.
Well, I think somebody the other day, Michael Chaney, Chancellor of the University of Western Australia, talked about us being a bit like California. And I think if you look at the United States, look at Canada, the western side of the continent seem to produce states that have large resources and are wanting to be a bit independent from eastern located capital cities.
I think Michael Chaney was saying that certainly it could be like California because that obviously was a state that was the sixth biggest economy in the world, although not doing enormously well at the moment. But that Texan idea, the frontier state, which it truly is, to its great credit, in an increasingly urbanised, rather predictable-looking Australia. This is not a predictable-looking place. It produces fantastic entrepreneurs a real go-get-'em attitude, which occasionally produces the odd, corporate crook that you don't like too. But it is like
had a few
Texas.
of those.
It is, though. But it is like Texas, and it said, we're big and self-confident, and I know you might want to tease us now and again, but look what we've got.
Yeah.
I reckon that's very alive.
Let's return to the climate change debate, Andrew Charlton, because what you've written is in some ways very, very alarming about the state of opinion and the shortage of time and so on. You were an advisor to Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister, who some people here allege was stabbed in the back by the current Prime Minister and is now Foreign Minister. And you went to the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference, and you find that a pretty depressing and dispiriting experience.
Yeah, it's hard to overstate how important climate change is to the Australian political debate at the moment. We have had an extremely tumultuous period in our political history. We've had 6 leaders of political parties in the last 3.5 years, and 5 of those have lost their leadership, at least partly, and in many cases principally, because of the issue of climate change. It is an issue which is tearing our Labor Party apart, separating its traditional working class base from its urban progressive constituency. It's splitting the
New Labour and Old Labour, as we'd say in Britain.
It's the perfect wedge issue for the Labor Party at the moment, and it's been extremely difficult for the Liberal Party as well. It's cost the Liberal Party at least 2 of its leaders in the last 5 years. So it's been an issue which has really redrawn the political landscape in Australia. And I think a lot of those issues are issues that are mirrored in the global debate. Climate change is going to be an extremely difficult global challenge.
But it's also a global challenge where a lot of the world's attention is going to be focused on Australia and the carbon tax, if that happens. What's the way forward then?
Well, I think
you're advising Julia Gillard now. You're telling her how to pick her way through this minefield. What do you tell her?
Well, Julia Gillard has done.
I mean, you're not. I should emphasise that's just my hypothesis in this parallel world. That's what you're doing.
Well, look, Australia has taken a big step forward in implementing a carbon price, and that will have a significant effect on Australia's emissions. And there are a number of other ancillary policies which will be required to reduce our emissions. And the scale of that challenge to reduce Australia's emissions by around 80% by 2050 is an extraordinary challenge, principally a technological and engineering challenge, and it will be very difficult and very costly. And that's the kind of challenge that every country around the world will face over the next 40 years.
But where are the politicians telling people that that's what they're going to have to do?
Well, I think it's very difficult to describe the scale of the challenge in the absence of very clear solutions. No politician in their right mind presents problems without solutions, and at the moment, I think that's a mirror of the global issue.
Danny Srikandaraja, Commonwealth perspective on that. These are the kind of problems that lots of countries are starting to grapple with, but nobody is coming near to a sort of package that is sellable to any of the electorates.
Well, I think it's got to be about finding ways of addressing those sort of wedge issues on the multilateral front. We've been to, Andrew literally has been to Copenhagen and seen the problems of that sort of negotiation. And I think maybe some sort of bottom-up approach where you take a few countries that have, take the Maldives and Australia, which have a shared interest in terms of carbon, and try to develop ways and grow them up. I think that's the potential there. It strikes me, having stepped off a plane from England and seen the contrast that I saw here, that I'm not convinced whether change, the sort of changes that Andrew wants to see, will happen at the best of times or at the worst of times. I'm dreading going back to London because it's going back to the bleak economic context there, where people are saying, well, we're never going to make the sort of progressive change that we really want because it's too difficult. Whereas here it seems it's the perfect opportunity to do so, but yet politicians aren't showing the leadership necessarily to capture the moment.
Because they aren't convinced of the need for it.
Yeah.
Now, Australia produces, I think, 1.6% of the world's greenhouse gases. Now, why are we leading the world with a carbon price that's more than anybody else has, when it may well have a very significant influence or impact on our industries? Because our mining industry, for example, is very energy intensive, and it is in a competitive environment. So if we're taxing our industry here, and the Africans aren't taxing their industries, their mining industries, then we are at a competitive disadvantage. And that needs to be looked at, because all the politicians are telling Australians is none of you will be worse off. We'll just use the carbon tax to pay for increased pensions or whatever. But the debate has never got beyond that, really. But I think Australians generally have not made up their mind yet about climate change. I think there is a genuine disconnect, if you like, between the two sides of the argument and how serious it really is.
Well, Australians and British and many other people too. I mean, this is the divided argument that Andrew was talking about, where it seems to be conducted now with a sort of almost kind of extreme zealotry on both sides. You have to scream at people now. You're a denier, which that was a phrase from Holocaust denier. Then it became climate change denier. And on the other side, people are equally extreme. Is there any way through this back to a kind of a calmer conversation, do you think, Andrew Charlton?
I think it's very, very difficult. I mean, climate change has sort of become this policy inkblot, and every different constituency maps their own prejudices across it. You know, if you're right wing, then climate change is an excuse for the UN to create a global government and take over the world. If you're left wing, you know, climate change is an issue that's been brought about by the terrible excesses of capitalism. So it's become an issue which has become, for what is essentially a scientific and technological issue, it's become incredibly emotional and divisive.
And every day there is a new piece of information available to validate how you feel.
Precisely. It's, you know, people kind of make up their mind based on their own sense of who they are and their own prejudices, and then map the factoids to fit their case.
And you can certainly in Britain you can read a newspaper or magazine which confirms whatever view you take, and you get lots and lots of scientific and other reports which make it abundantly clear that the planet isn't warming up, or at least it's not humanly caused, or vice versa, that it's warming up even faster and we're all in terrible trouble.
Well, I disagree with that. I think that the scientific consensus is really strong, you know, on an issue like this. I think the body of scientific work and the...
I'm just saying that if you don't accept that point of view, you can live inside a sort of a political bubble almost, which screens out most of that.
Absolutely. There are plenty of non-scientific voices arguing against climate change. Yeah.
And it should be said, some scientific voices on the other side as well. So what do we do with this issue? Because, I mean, you in your essay, you talk about renewables, and you give some absolutely startling statistics on the number of windmills or the sheer quantity of solar panels that would be needed to even start to replace carbon-based fuel.
Yes, it is an extremely large challenge. There's no question about that. I think everyone wishes that it could be solved with a few more windmills and a few more solar panels, but unfortunately that's not the case. The scale of renewable energy and other forms of clean energy that will be required is literally massive. And I think the work that's been done on the UK is that in order to provide 100% renewable energy in the UK, you'd need to cover the whole of Wales with windmills and have a solar panel array that was as large as Greater London. So, you know, this is a massive engineering challenge.
And it's not going to happen, is it? I mean, the danger is...
Unfortunately, you don't have the sun to make the solar panels really effective.
There is
part
that.
of the problem.
It's a cheap shot, Andrew.
Isn't there a danger that we're only going to start to see movement on this, assuming that we need to see movement on this, after some further sort of disastrous events around the world, that public opinion is not, at the moment, prepared to go as far as some of the more extreme solutions that we're told are needed?
I wonder if it's a point where you maybe pull back the answering the big question and start answering the question about, how long will our fossil fuels enable us to keep living the way that we live. That seems to be something that people understand, and whether that becomes the forerunner to the more complex debate of, okay, well, what are those new technologies? Actually, we don't think we've invented them yet.
And yet peak oil, as I think Andrew points out in his essay, keeps being discussed. We're about to run out of oil, we're about to run out of gas, and then fracking comes along, or whatever it is, and there's another 20 years.
Yeah, well, it's more than 20 years. I mean, in terms of shale gas, there's hundreds of years.
This is precisely the problem. I think there's enough, we have enough fossil fuels to really badly damage the planet if we continue to use them at the rate we have been.
And that's walking around Perth for the last few days. I just keep thinking to myself: is this the last best example of the old paradigm, or about the start of something new? Because as I think the ministers talked about, Australia's been digging things up out of the ground for hundreds of years and flogging them to whoever's willing. And my question is, how long will it last in the case of Western Australia or indeed Australia? Can it keep doing that?
Well,
For a
presumably.
very long time.
Yeah, I suppose the reserves are there. The question is that the wisest thing to do for the planet?
Well, it's a question of, take iron ore, for example. It's being used by the Chinese to create a better living standard for their people. That's a good reason for selling them iron ore. We have vast amounts of iron ore in this country. We have vast amounts of coal. We have vast amounts of gas. We have vast amounts of uranium. And we're largely underexplored. So who knows what's there that hasn't been found yet.
It does make me think, coming to Western Australia, that this is one of the oddest places I've been politically, because it's a very, very traditional place in many ways. Traditional industries doing very well in the traditional way, and yet it's a country with things like the carbon tax, which aspires to be unbelievably progressive and very, very different. It's an extreme political system that you have here.
I think it's our slightly awkward teenage years here in Western Australia.
Is there
don't
something
you
you want
think?
to share with us, Jeff?
There is a lot of talk of where we've been and that this is our past, and there's certain aspiration to what we want to be when we grow up, and we have good days and bad days and mood swings along the way.
Well, I think every one of my guests would be delighted to be described as an awkward teenager. Danny Shiskandarajah, Jeff Hutchinson, the Minister, Norman Moore and Andrew Charlton, thank you all very much indeed for joining me. Andrew's Man-Made World that I discussed, it will be published next month in Australia's Quarterly Essay. And details of all of today's guests are on the Start the Week website. Next week, I'll be in Sydney to discuss Australia's cultural heritage and the stolen generations with the writers Thomas Keneally and Kate Grenville and the Aboriginal opera singer and ABBA fan, Deborah Cheetham. Join me if you can, but for now, goodbye. If you've enjoyed this BBC podcast, why not try some others, such as The Forum, the discussion programme about global ideas. And to find out more, visit bbcworldservice.com/forum.
Over the next who knows how many years.
I mean, as I said at the beginning, it is an organisation with so many different kinds of states, tiny, tiny little dots in the ocean, through to some of the world's most important economies, huge, huge countries, like Australia, like India. And it's said that what binds the Commonwealth together are its values.
Yeah.
And yet I wonder which values actually bind it together.
Well, I think that was the question that dominated the agenda over the last few days. And, history alone is not going to keep the Commonwealth alive. In fact, history is the thing that binds Commonwealth countries, but history alone is not going to be a sufficient reason for it to exist in the next few decades. And values is probably the closest thing we have. It's a voluntary association that, when it's been at its best, has talked to a moral conscience. The struggle against apartheid in Africa, in southern Africa, was the Commonwealth at its best, playing that.
Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello from Perth, Australia, the first of two Start the Week shows from Down Under, and a different perspective on some of the issues we've been talking about pretty regularly at home, from Britain's place in the world to the rise of China and climate change. I'm joined by Jeff Hutchinson, who hosts the morning radio show on ABC Perth, the most isolated major city on earth, by the way, capital of the huge state of West Australia, which is enjoying a boom mainly fuelled by mining, and its Minister for Mines, Norman Moore, joins me, as does the former government economic advisor, Andrew Charlton, who writes about climate change, a huge issue in Australia as at home. First, though, at the end of the Perth Commonwealth Summit, these meetings go by the chewy and rather drear acronym CHOGM. We're going to talk about whether this huge organisation, which claims to represent a third
vanguard role, and I think many of us, inside and outside, look to the Commonwealth as a values-based association. But what we've seen this week is that it's very difficult to get the Malawis and the Ugandas of the world to agree a set of common values with the Australias and the Britons of the world.
And at the same time, there is just an enormous amount of sort of politically correct hot air swilling around it. I mean, I sat through the last press conference of the Commonwealth, and I have never been at a duller press conference, I have to say.
You should have had the pleasure of sitting through hours and hours of meetings that preceded the press conference.
Jeff Hutchinson, what do your listeners make of an event like CHOGM? It's caused huge amount of disruption, of course, in Perth, but it has put Perth on the front of a lot of front pages.
Not disruption, excitement. I think there are two stories this week. One is the visit by Her Majesty and the Duke of Edinburgh to a town where she has always been very warmly welcomed. There's been Perth has looked very nice. Much excitement that we win Chogham. So there's been a lot of goodwill and a lot of good feeling about what's been achieved here. And then there's the Chogham part of it all, which I wouldn't say it bores people rigid, but I think people have started the week hearing exactly as Danny said, these phrases and affirmations of shared values. And then every now and again you get a whisper from someone who says, it's the Queen and cricket, really, that is the shared value. And that is a historical tie and a traditional tie. And look, let me just very briefly read you a little bit of this afternoon's communique for those who weren't here to get the highlights. Heads reaffirmed their commitment to the values and principles of the Commonwealth and agreed to a series of actions to maintain the Commonwealth's relevance, to ensure its effectiveness in responding to contemporary global challenges and to build resilient societies and economies.
It does sound, doesn't it, Danny, a little bit like we've resolved of the planet's humanity. 54 countries, big and small, rich and poor. Whether it really works, whether it really makes any sense. Danny Sriskandaraja runs the Commonwealth Foundation, part of the Commonwealth setup. Danny, you're inside the organisation, but you're allowed to be critical of it too. Let's start off talking about this particular summit. It was said to be going to be a failure if it didn't produce an independent commissioner on human rights and didn't agree at Charter on human rights. Hasn't done those things. Has it been a failure?
Well, it's been a bit of both. It's been a success in the sense that, at least for the first time in a long time, the Commonwealth is talking about itself and how it can get teeth and become relevant. But I think many of us, especially after the week we've had, feel a bit depressed that, this iconic new measure, an independent commissioner on human rights, has been kicked into the long grass because it's going to be put to a committee of ministers who'll consider it seriously.